Part 63. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 621. At this time, Su Yuyan heard Ye Langshuang say this, and the smallest smile became more obvious at that time. At this time, she just coughed lightly, and then said in a deep voice, "I never like to joke with people, and I don't like to deceive others, so what I said is naturally true." After hearing what Su Yuyan said, Ye Langshuang hesitated for a moment, and then nodded lightly. "Okay, I really can't refuse the condition you made, so I can agree to you." At this time, Ye Langshuang said softly, and there was a bit of complexity in his eyes. After Su Yuyan heard Ye Langshuang's agreement, she was naturally ecstatic, and then she walked towards Ye Langshuang with a smile. She just leaned over and lowered her head, and then she said softly, "Okay, then I will wait for you to come over at that time, it's better not to stand me up." After Su Yuyan finished speaking, she turned around and left. Ye Langshuang stared at Su Yuyan for a long time before slowly coming back to his senses. He only pondered for a moment, and a bit of complexity flashed in his eyes. At this time, the smile on Ye Langshuang's mouth became more and more obvious. "It's really interesting. I have always wanted to see this little guy. I didn't expect that I really got the chance this time. Such an opportunity can't be let go." The smile on Ye Langshuang's face began to gradually become more obvious, and there was a bit of playfulness in his eyes. After a while, for some reason, Su Yuyan suddenly had a bad premonition in her heart. She frowned slightly and her face sank slightly. No, why do I always have a bad premonition? This little girl won't plot against me. After Su Yuyan thought of this, she couldn't help but shook her head slightly, and then she coughed lightly. "Ahem, no, it shouldn't be." But Su Yuyan said to the end, even she herself had some doubts. After a while, Su Yuyan shook her head helplessly. Then, the two people slowly walked out to the distance. The two people stared at Su Yuyan's back, and then they looked at each other and followed in opposite directions. About 3 hours later, Su Yuyan and Ye Langshuang came back to their senses at the same time. They suddenly stopped, and then looked behind them, but when they turned around, they found that there was nothing behind them. At this time, the smile on Su Yuyan's face began to become more and more obvious. She just shook her head and then changed her route slightly. For Su Yuyan, this was naturally a commonplace. About a quarter of an hour later, the man following Su Yuyan felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. The man stared at Su Yuyan, and suddenly had a bad feeling in his heart. At this time, he suddenly widened his eyes, and then his expression suddenly condensed, and then he secretly shouted, "Not good. It's bad." After the man finished speaking, he wanted to turn around and leave, but at this time, a smiling face suddenly appeared behind the man, and the eyes of the smiling face were fixed on the man, and there was a bit of teasing in the eyes. At this time, the man suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. At this time, the man stared at Su Yuyan, and then he coughed lightly. "Ahem, hello." After Su Yuyan heard what the man said, her face suddenly turned cold, and her expression suddenly darkened. At this time, Su Yuyan looked down at the man with her eyes fixed on him. "What if I say I'm not good?" At this time, the man coughed awkwardly, and then waved his hand casually. "You won't say you're not good." At this time, Su Yuyan took a step forward, and then the murderous aura on her body began to become more and more obvious at this moment. "But I think I'm not good now, shouldn't you give me an explanation?" Su Yuyan's voice suddenly became gloomy, and the cold sweat on the man's forehead came down like a broken dam at this moment. At this time, Su Yuyan approached the guy step by step, and the guy kept retreating to the back, and the two of them were like this. After a while, the man seemed to have made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, then suddenly took a step forward, and his face suddenly became more ferocious. I'm going to fight you. After the man finished speaking, he suddenly rushed towards Suyuyan. At this time, the man was extremely fast. In just one breath, he was already in front of Suyuyan. Naturally, Suyuyan was not a vegetarian. She just turned slightly sideways to the side, and then dodged the man's head-on blow, and then suddenly jumped towards the man's face. He was kicked hard on the chest. But who would have thought that the person would suddenly pull back due to the strength of Suyuyan's kick, and then ran away frantically towards the back. When Suyuyan saw this scene, her face instantly turned ugly, and then she immediately chased after the guy. But who knew that in just such a moment, that guy would have already disappeared without a trace. After Suyuyan saw this scene, she couldn't help but clenched her fists and almost said through gritted teeth, "Asshole, don't let me find you, otherwise, if I see you, I'll beat you up every time." If those students saw Amelia Su like this, their jaws would definitely drop in shock. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 622. At this time, Suyuyan tidied herself up a little, and then turned around and left without looking back. At this time, on a certain tree, the man watched Suyuyan leave from a distance, and then he was relieved, and then he slowly slid down from the tree, with a sense of fear in his eyes and eyebrows. It's terrible, that woman is really terrible, this woman. I don't know what the situation is with that guy. I hope he is not as perverted as this woman. After saying this, the man sighed, and there was a bit of helplessness between his eyebrows. At this time, another person followed Ye Lengshuang and walked on the road for a while. Ye Lengshuang's back was extremely graceful. Just taking a step forward, the man almost couldn't take his eyes off her. The man stared at Ye Lengshuang's back with a smile on his face, as if he was crazy, and it looked extremely funny. At this time, Ye Lengshuang just snorted coldly, and her face became slightly ugly. She continued to walk forward for a while, but the road was getting more and more off track. After the guy behind Ye Lengshuang found this, his face instantly became ugly. What's wrong with this girl? Why is the road getting more and more off track? What does she want to do? The man's face suddenly sank, and then he took a deep breath. He mustered up his courage and chased after Ye Lengshuang, but after just passing an alley, the man suddenly found that Ye Lengshuang had disappeared. At this time, the man's face instantly became ugly, his face suddenly condensed, and his heart suddenly had a bad premonition. At this moment, he secretly shouted that it was not good. Oh no! At this moment, he subconsciously wanted to withdraw directly, but the next second later, he turned around and saw a pretty figure standing behind him. The woman was indeed beautiful, but it was a pity that she had a cold face, which made everyone feel bored when they saw this face. Ye Lengshuang stared at the man with a smile on her face, and there was a bit of teasing in her eyes. At this moment, Ye Lengshuang looked down at him, and there was a bit of gloom between her eyebrows, and the murderous aura on her body became more and more obvious. At this time, the man saw Ye Lengshuang, and his face turned ugly in an instant after he found himself. His face suddenly turned cold, and then he rushed directly towards Ye Lengshuang. There was no nonsense between him and Ye Lengshuang. The man covered his face with Ye Lengshuang, and he couldn't see the man's appearance clearly. Originally, Ye Lengshuang wanted to see through the man's identity through the man's attack. But although the man's moves were very sharp, it was still unclear where the moves came from. At this time, the sneer on Ye Lengshuang's mouth became more and more obvious. She just shook her head and her face suddenly turned cold. It's really interesting. I'm really getting more and more interested in you. Ye Lengshuang's voice was a little low, and the murderous aura on her body became more and more obvious. After hearing what Ye Lengshuang said, the man also smiled strangely, "You will see me more powerful later." The man's voice was a little low, and there seemed to be some other meanings in his words, so after hearing what the man said, Ye Langshuang's face instantly became ugly. Ye Langshuang took a step forward, and then the murderous intention on her body was released without reservation at this time, and then suddenly Ye Langshuang flew forward and rushed directly towards the man. When the man saw Ye Langshuang rushing towards him, a dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. The man also rushed towards Ye Langshuang, and the two of them soon collided with each other. At this time, Ye Langshuang only felt a burst of numbness in his arms. The man's strength was amazing. At this time, Ye Langshuang was directly knocked out by the force, and in the end, Ye Langshuang still landed steadily. After the man saw this, the sneer at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. "What? I thought you had some skills, but now it seems that you are just so-so. You are really far behind." The man's voice was unusually low and hoarse. But at this time, Ye Langshuang suddenly smiled. Ye Langshuang just glanced coldly at the man, and then waved his hand casually. "Really? Then come here first and see how you are doing." After Ye Langshuang finished speaking, she glanced at the man. The smile on her lips became more and more obvious, and there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. At this moment, the man suddenly saw that his arm, which had just held the dagger, was suddenly covered with a layer of frost. That layer of frost began to gradually invade the man's body. After seeing this scene, the man's face suddenly became ugly. The man's eyes stared at Ye Langshuang and his expression suddenly became gloomy. "Ye Langshuang, you actually plotted against me." At this time, Ye Langshuang suddenly laughed. He just waved his hand casually, and then spread his hands lightly. "No, no, no, don't say it so badly. I didn't plot against you. This was just caused by your own carelessness. Who can you blame for this?" Ye Langshuang's smile began to become more and more obvious, and there was a bit of mockery in his eyes. After seeing this scene, the man knew that he would never be the opponent of this woman, so the man had already had the idea of retreating in his heart. The man's face sank slightly, and then he took a step forward. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 623. At this time, Ye Langshuang was also facing a powerful enemy. Her eyes were fixed on the man, and then she began to adopt a completely defensive posture. At this time, Ye Langshuang stared at the man nervously, with a gloomy look in his eyes. And at this critical moment, Ye Langshuang originally thought that the man would attack her again, but at this moment, the man actually dodged and fled without looking back. After Ye Langshuang saw this scene, she was instantly stunned. Her eyes were fixed on the man, and there was a look of disbelief in the corners of her eyes and brows. At this time, the man ran away like this crazily, and almost in the blink of an eye, he completely disappeared in front of Ye Langshuang. After Ye Langshuang saw this scene, he couldn't help but rolled his eyes, and then took a deep breath. You're really a coward, but you might as well run away to save yourself a headache. After Ye Langshuang finished speaking, she slowly walked forward. At this time, after the man ran for a while, he breathed a sigh of relief. At this moment, Lin Yu was naturally speechless for a while after what he had just experienced. At this moment, he had no idea what he should do now. Lin Yu's expression condensed slightly, and then he couldn't help but shook his head slightly. Headache, headache, boring, boring. At this moment, time was passing by little by little. After hearing the bell ringing, Lin Yu's expression began to relax. But now, even if get out of class is over, Elder Dugu still has no intention of getting off the podium. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face became slightly ugly. At this time, he turned his head and glanced at Lei Yan, and then spoke softly. What's going on? Why does Elder Dugu have no intention of dismissing get out of class now? After Lei Yan heard what Lin Yu said, he was slightly stunned at first, but he came to his senses after a moment, and he just smiled at Lin Yu. Don't forget that Elder Dugu didn't come to the first class, so Elder Dugu won't finish the get out of class this time. He will teach both classes in succession. After Lin Yu heard what Lei Yan said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this time, he began a long ordeal. Although Elder Dugu saw Lin Yu distracted at the side, Elder Dugu did not dare to call Lin Yu up again because he had learned from the past. Finally, I finally waited for the bell to ring for the end of school. After Elder Dugu tidied up, he turned around and left. At this time, Lin Yu stretched a lot, and his eyes were full of excitement. At this time, the smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. Great, simply great, get out of class is finally over. At this time, Elder Dugu, who was just about to come back to get something, happened to hear what Lin Yu said. The two people looked at each other, and the situation instantly became awkward. At this time, the surrounding air seemed to be frozen. At this time, after seeing this scene, Lei Yan also cast a sympathetic look at Lin Yu, and then slowly walked to Lin Yu's side and gently patted Lin Yu's shoulder. Lei Yan whispered to Lin Yu like this. Bro, good luck to you. At this time, Lin Yu was also on the verge of crying for a while. At this time, Lin Yu also took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. Elder Dugu turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then coughed lightly. Ahem, you must listen carefully and get out of class from now on. Don't be like this after class. Do you understand? Lin Yu was naturally very well behaved at this time. He nodded gently, and then smiled at Elder Dugu. That's nature, I understand, I understand. Lin Yu just said in a low voice. After Elder Dugu heard what Lin Yu said, he nodded with satisfaction, and then Elder Dugu and Lin Yu walked outside. At this time, Lin Yu felt as if he was suffering by the side of Elder Dugu. At this moment, Elder Dugu seemed to have suddenly remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. By the way, when we were in class just now, you seemed to be interested in Qi Lian Huang. The control of the sand beast is not very good yet, and the energy seems to be pouring out, am I right? Elder Dugu's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, he was slightly stunned at first, and then nodded lightly. He turned his head and glanced at Elder Dugu. Finally, he asked in such a low voice. That's true. Is there any problem? Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu, and a bit of complexity flashed in his eyes. At this time, Elder Dugu gently rubbed his chin, and after a moment of silence, he sighed. Alas, there are indeed some problems, but the problems are not big. Anyway, that woman has said that she will teach you how to control the red-banded yellow sand beast. At that time, that little girl will be able to help you. If Elder Dugu hadn't mentioned Lin Yu, he might not have remembered that he seemed to have to face that terrifying woman. When Elder Dugu finished speaking, Lin Yu turned his head and looked at Elder Dugu, and then asked in a low voice. Why do I see that everyone seems to be very afraid of Miss Su? I really don't understand this. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu, and there was a bit of confusion in his eyes. At this time, Elder Dugu heard Lin Yu's words. After he finished speaking, he just pondered for a moment. The smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and a hint of sympathy flashed in his eyes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 624. At this time, after Lin Yu saw Elder Dugu's sympathetic look, he suddenly began to realize that this matter was not simple. Lin Yu subconsciously took a few steps back, and then walked towards him like this. Elder Dugu glanced this way. Elder Dugu, if you have any problems, just tell me. There is no need to continue to show off here. At this moment, Elder Dugu heard Lin Yu. After saying this, he couldn't hold back his gloating smile, and then he started laughing directly. Ha ha ha, forgive me, I just couldn't help it. The most terrifying thing about that woman, little guy, is that you can never guess what she is thinking, and she likes to play pranks, but you can do it too. Don't worry, if you don't do anything excessive, you will only suffer some physical pain at most, but your life will not be in danger. After Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Then according to your wishes, if you contact her, your life will be in danger. At this time, Elder Dugu turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu with a smile on his face. The smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and his eyes were full of joy. Kind of playful color. You can't say for sure. It depends on your luck. If you are lucky, nothing will happen to you. But if you are unlucky, I can only wish you the best of luck. After Elder Dugu finished speaking, he walked away with a smile on his face. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and his heart was filled with tears. There was a moment of silence. After Lin Yu returned home, he saw Dugu Qinghong. After Dugu Qinghong saw Lin Yu, he was naturally very excited, so he rushed towards Lin Yu, and then he threw himself into Lin Yu's arms, while Elder Dugu was following behind Lin Yu. Dugu Qinghong didn't see Elder Dugu just now because of the doorframe. When Dugu Qinghong came to Lin Yu, she happened to see Elder Dugu just like this. After Elder Dugu saw this scene, he seemed to be stunned for a moment. At this time, he took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. At this time, Elder Dugu's heart felt as if 10,000 grass and mud horses were galloping past. After seeing Elder Dugu, Dugu Qinghong came back to his senses in an instant. His pretty face turned red for a while, and there was a hint of shyness between his brows. Grandfather? At this time, Dugu Qinghong's voice was as thin as a mosquito wire. Elder Dugu took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. Then he turned his head and glanced at Dugu Qinghong. Ahem, Qinghong, come here with me. At this time, Dugu Qinghong felt helpless for a while, and then he turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu as if asking for help. At this time, Lin Yu didn't even know how to explain to Elder Dugu, so naturally, he could only gently spread his hands. Dugu Qinghong felt helpless for a while, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. At this time, Dugu Qinghong could only follow Elder Dugu and slowly walked inside. Both Dugu Qinghong and Lin Yu thought that they were dead this time. But who knew that Elder Dugu was in a good mood at this time? After Elder Dugu and Dugu Qinghong walked in, they immediately turned their heads and glanced at Dugu Qinghong. Ahem, what's the relationship between you and Lin Yu? Dugu Qinghong heard it. After Elder Dugu finished speaking, there was a bit of a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and then he spoke softly. Ah, what about us? We are just ordinary friends, just friends. At this time, Dugu Qinghong was even a little incoherent. After hearing what Dugu Qinghong said, Elder Dugu turned his head and stared directly at Dugu Qinghong. Just looking up and down, the smile on the corner of his mouth became even more obvious. Qinghong, actually you are not young anymore, and Grandpa does not have to stop you in everything. As long as you have ideas in your mind and know how to distinguish, in fact, in many cases, Grandpa will not restrict you too much. Elder Dugu just said this unhurriedly, turned his head and glanced at Dugu Qinghong, with a slight smile on his lips. At this time, after Dugu Qinghong heard what Elder Dugu said, she was instantly stunned on the spot. Her eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu, and her eyebrows were completely blank. It was full of surprise. Grandpa, do you really think so? Elder Dugu heard this. After Dugu Qinghong said this, he coughed lightly, and then waved his hands. That's natural. When did Grandpa lie to you? At this time, Dugu Qinghong was naturally very excited, and then he rushed to the side of Elder Dugu, and then smiled. I knew that Grandpa was the best. After seeing Dugu Qinghong like this, Elder Dugu couldn't help but coughed lightly, and then waved his hand casually. Ahem, okay, I know, it seems that the two of you are making rapid progress now. Elder Dugu whispered in a low voice, and Dugu Qinghong couldn't help but blush slightly after hearing what Elder Dugu said, and then lowered his head. After seeing Dugu Qinghong like this, Elder Dugu felt that his heart was bleeding. Elder Dugu took a deep breath, and then calmed down a little. Okay, how far have you two progressed? After hearing what Elder Dugu said, Dugu Qinghong rolled her eyes at Elder Dugu, then smiled and said, "What are you talking about?" Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 625. At this time, Dugu Qinghong also rolled her eyes at Elder Dugu angrily. After seeing this scene, Elder Dugu was relieved. Remember, never do anything that goes too far, do you understand? Dugu Qinghong nodded heavily. Elder Dugu gave Dugu Qinghong a few more instructions, and then waved his hand casually. Grandpa is a little tired, you go down first. At this time, Dugu Qinghong nodded after hearing what Elder Dugu said, and then turned around and left. At this time, Elder Dugu's eyes and brows flashed with a bit of complexity, and his eyes were fixed on Dugu Qinghong's back. Oh, I originally just wanted to take advantage of that little guy, but now I didn't expect that things have turned out like this, but it's really a headache. Qinghong, why don't you let Grandpa save it? What about peace of mind? Elder Dugu was also in a fit of rage at that moment, wanting to cry but not having any tears, and his heart was naturally full of helplessness. At this time, Dugu Qinghong was relieved after he came out. Although Dugu Qinghong looked harmless on the surface, in fact, his mind was extraordinary and he was very smart. After waiting for a while, Dugu Qinghong walked directly towards Lin Yu's room. After Dugu Qinghong arrived at Lin Yu's room, he opened the door and walked in quietly. Lin Yu was thinking about what he should do on Sunday. After all, after seeing Elder Dugu's comments about Suyuyan, Lin Yu had to become wary of Suyuyan. Ignoring other things for the time being, there is just one thing, which is very important, that is, he is hiding his strength now. If Suyuyan discovers that he is hiding his strength, he will be in trouble in the end. After all, deliberately hiding one's strength obviously has some small thoughts. If the time comes, it will be okay if he is just kicked out. If the time comes, he is accidentally pushed directly to the opposite side, it will be troublesome. After all, Elder Dugu is also an elder in this battle academy, and Dugu Qinghong is now his woman, so even if he is pushed to the opposite side by Suyuyan, Lin Yu will probably only suffer the loss of being dumb, or at most, if he just ran away and wanted to resist, he had to leave some room for the two of them. While Lin Yu was thinking wildly, Dugu Qinghong slowly walked behind Lin Yu, and then hugged Lin Yu directly. Lin Yu's expression also twisted slightly, and then he turned his head and saw Dugu Qinghong behind him. After Lin Yu saw Dugu Qinghong, he was relieved. Then Lin Yu became so angry that he rolled his eyes fiercely at Dugu Qinghong, and then gently scratched his head. Scratched Dugu Qinghong's little nose. "You silly girl, when will you come in?" In fact, Lin Yu had already discovered this little girl when Dugu Qinghong first came in, but Lin Yu did it on purpose. He wanted to cooperate with Dugu Qinghong in order to make this little girl happy. At this time, after Dugu Qinghong saw that he had really scared Lin Yu, the smile on the corner of his mouth became even more obvious. "Tch, you are so stupid. Of course I just came in, but look at you, you seem to be thinking about something. What are you thinking about?" Dugu Qinghong stared straight at Lin Yu, with a bit of complexity flashing in his eyes. At this time, After Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, he coughed lightly. Ahem, guess. Dugu Qinghong just found the soft flesh on Lin Yu's waist, and then her slender hands were on Lin Yu, rubbing the soft flesh on her waist, and finally looked at Lin Yu with a smile on her face. When Lin Yu saw this scene, his scalp was numb for a while, so he quickly waved his hand and smiled. Actually, it's nothing, but something happened during class today. Suyuyan said she would give me extra tutoring on the weekend. After Dugu Qinghong heard what Lin Yu said, a hint of investigation flashed through her eyes. She turned her head and stared straight at Lin Yu, with a complete look in her eyes. Sympathy, mixed with a bit of schadenfreude. At this time, after Lin Yu saw Dugu Qinghong like this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Lin Yu turned his head and glanced at Dugu Qinghong, and then spoke in a low voice. Is this woman really so scary? Why do you all react like this? The same goes for my classmates, the same goes for Elder Dugu, and the same goes for you. At this time, Lin Yu was like a 2-foot-long monk, confused, and his heart was full of confusion. At this time, after Dugu Qinghong heard what Lin Yu said, the bitter smile on the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. She turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then just like this a long sigh. Alas, this woman can no longer be described as scary. The adjective for this woman now should be perverted, very perverted. She is perverted in terms of strength and in every aspect. Dugu Qinghong said helplessly. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, he felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave, with a look of complete helplessness between his brows. So is there any good way to deal with this woman now? Lin Yu turned around and stared directly at Dugu Qinghong, his expression also slightly raised. Dugu Qinghong touched his chin, pondered for a moment, and then shook his head slightly. You can only pray that the woman will be normal for a few days. If the woman is normal for a few days, maybe nothing will happen to you. If the woman is not normal, I'm afraid. Dugu Qinghong paused immediately after saying this. After Lin Yu pondered for a moment, he nodded slightly, and then waved his hand casually. Forget it, the soldiers will cover up the water and the earth. Anyway, we will definitely be able to deal with it by then. That little girl, you don't have to worry so much now. Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 626. Lin Yu has been living a peaceful life these past few days. After all, there is nothing going on in this school. Although there were a few guys at first who seemed a little displeased with Lin Yu, so they came to trouble Lin Yu everywhere. But after being dealt with by Lin Yu, those guys all became honest. At this time, Lin Yu had a piece of dogtail grass in his mouth with his hands on his hands. His eyes were full of amusement, and the smile on the corner of his mouth was even more obvious. Lin Yu has been living quite comfortably these days. The day came to Sunday in the blink of an eye, which was the special training day that Suyuyan had assigned to Lin Yu. Lin Yu got up early that day. At this time, Lin Yu stretched out like this. Looking at the sunshine shining on his body, the smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. It's interesting, it's really interesting. Now is the time to meet that little girl. When Lin Yu thought of this, a playful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he slowly walked out. After Lin Yu walked out, Dugu Qinghong came face to face. At this time, Dugu Qinghong looked slightly panicked. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he just felt that Dugu Qinghong was a little strange, but what exactly was strange, even Lin Yu himself couldn't explain clearly. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Dugu Qinghong, his face was slightly raised, and then he looked at Dugu Qinghong with a smile on his face. What? What's the matter? Dugu Qinghong looked at Lin Yu with a completely careless look. After Dugu Qinghong saw this scene, she was furious at the time. Dugu Qinghong glared at Lin Yu fiercely. Of course there is something, and there is something big. After Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, his expression suddenly condensed, and then he walked towards Dugu Qinghong. If there's anything big going on, let's talk about it. Lin Yu just said in a low voice. A bit of confusion flashed in his eyes, and his face was slightly raised, looking a little anxious. After Dugu Qinghong saw Lin Yu like this, she couldn't help but hide her face and let out a giggle. Her eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and a hint of amusement flashed at the corner of her mouth. Of course you are afraid. You will be taught a lesson by that little witch and you won't be able to get out of bed. Otherwise, what else could happen? After Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while, but at this time, he was so relieved. I thought something happened to you, but it doesn't look like it's the best now. When Dugu Qinghong heard Lin Yu say this, he waved his little fist, and then glared at Lin Yu fiercely. Hey, what are you talking about? If you dare to say anything nonsense again, believe it or not, I will beat you up. Dugu Qinghong just waved his fist at Lin Yu, with a hint of warning in his eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, he suddenly smiled, and then waved his hand casually. Stop talking nonsense, it's better. It's almost time, I'd better go there quickly, otherwise I'll be late and be embarrassed by that guy. Lin Yu just said softly. After Dugu Qinghong heard what Lin Yu said, she nodded with satisfaction, and then waved her hand. Okay, go quickly, that woman is not easy to mess with, remember to be careful. Dugu Qinghong glanced at Lin Yu, and then gave him instructions in a low voice. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Dugu Qinghong said, he nodded slightly, and then sighed quietly. Oh, I know. Dugu Qinghong saw Lin Yu's dejected look. He didn't know why, but he was naturally very happy. If Lin Yu knew what Dugu Qinghong was thinking at this moment, Lin Yu would definitely vomit 3 liters of blood and die. At this time, Ye Langshuang and Suyiyan arrived at the dean's office early, and they were almost an hour away from the agreed time. Suyiyan and Ye Langshuang were just like this, sitting opposite each other. At this time, Suyiyan turned her head and glanced at Ye Langshuang. A bit of complexity seemed to flash in her eyes, as if she had something to say. She said, but she swallowed it back halfway. After Ye Langshuang saw Suyiyan like this, he suddenly smiled at that time. He stared at Suyiyan with a smile on his face, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. I know what you want to say. At this time, after Suyiyan heard Ye Langshuang say this, she suddenly smiled like this. Suyiyan turned her head and glanced at Ye Langshuang, and then spoke softly. Oh, then you should tell me what I want to say. The 2 people looked at each other, and a burst of fierce sparks burst out. At this time, Ye Langshuang also spoke unhurriedly. Someone was following me a few days ago, but I don't know if anyone is following you. Ye Langshuang said in a cold voice, her eyes fixed on Suyiyan's body, and her expression condensed slightly. At this time, after Suyiyan heard Ye Langshuang say this, a bit of surprise flashed between her eyebrows, and there was a bit of solemnity in her eyes. Someone is indeed following me. It's strange. It's really a bit strange. At this time, Suyiyan said in a deep voice, her face even more ugly. At this time, after Ye Langshuang heard what Suyiyan said, she waved her hands casually after a moment, and then sighed quietly. Hey, what do you think their purpose is? I feel that their purpose is not for the 2 of us. After all, the 2 of us have been in this position for so many years. Although there are many people watching eagerly, but I always feel that those people shouldn't be so brainless. Amelia Su said in a cold and unhurried voice. Survival of the beasts, awakening the beast taming system at the beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 627. Ye Langshuang's brows also slightly frowned, and at this moment, he suddenly seemed to remember something, and then the smile on the corner of his mouth became more obvious. I roughly know what they seem to be for. Ye Langshuang said slowly. After Suyuyan heard Ye Langshuang say this, she just pondered for a moment, and then coughed lightly. Ahem, I don't think so. Ye Langshuang just smiled at this time. Although the battle city looks calm on the surface, there is a price to pay under this calmness. Countless undercurrents are surging, and those undercurrents are turbulent. If we are not careful, we will fall over. At this time, Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang said helplessly, and there was a sense of helplessness in the corners of their eyes and eyebrows. After a while, Suyuyan just waved her hand casually, and then said softly, "That little guy is not an ordinary person. These guys are planning to take advantage of him, and they will definitely find him in the end. But I bet that no matter who it is, as long as they find this little guy, they will regret it." I say, Suyuyan just smiled, and a bit of amusement flashed in her eyes. At this time, the door of the room was suddenly pushed open, and then a man walked in. Who else could that man be but Lin Yu? Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang looked at Lin Yu at the same time. At this time, Lin Yu saw a woman standing next to Suyuyan. There was a flash of surprise in his eyes, and his face was slightly raised. There was a flash of strange colors between his eyebrows. This is... After Lin Yu finished speaking, he turned his head and looked at Suyuyan. There was a flash of confusion in his eyes, and his face was slightly raised. At this time, after Suyuyan heard Lin Yu say this, she just pointed at Ye Langshuang, and then began to introduce slowly. "This person is called Ye Langshuang, and she is here to guide you this time. She is also your teacher. Why don't you meet your teacher quickly?" Suyuyan looked at Lin Yu like this, and then smiled. At this time, Lin Yu heard Suyuyan's introduction, and then nodded gently, and then looked at Ye Langshuang, and then smiled slightly. "Boy, Lin Yu meets teacher yet." At this time, Ye Langshuang's eyes looked straight at Lin Yu, and a bit of complexity flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and his face was slightly raised. "Your name is Lin Yu." After Lin Yu heard Ye Langshuang say this, he nodded gently. "That's right." Ye Langshuang pondered for a moment, then took a deep breath and calmed down a little. "Hurry up and summon your red-striped yellow sand beast, let me take a look." Ye Langshuang said softly, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu. Although Lin Yu was a little unhappy with Ye Langshuang's indifferent attitude, he just nodded lightly at this time, and then smiled. "Okay." After Lin Yu finished speaking, he moved his mind, and the crazy yellow sand beast appeared in front of Ye Langshuang. When Ye Langshuang saw the red-striped yellow sand beast, he couldn't help but be stunned. The red-striped yellow sand beast was pitifully small. At this time, it stood on Lin Yu's shoulder and looked like a pet. There was no difference. After seeing this scene, Ye Langshuang's face was slightly raised, and then he said softly, "This little thing is only at the epic level now. Although it is not too difficult to control, it is indeed difficult to control it with your current soul power." Ye Langshuang's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and his face was slightly condensed, and a bit of complexity flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what Ye Langshuang said, Lin Yu nodded gently, and then smiled. "Yes, with my current soul power, it is really difficult to control him, but I can't say it for sure. Sometimes I still have ways to deal with this kind of little thing." Lin Yu stared at Ye Langshuang with a smile on his face, and the playful smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Ye Langshuang's face was also slightly condensed, and then he turned his head and looked at Lin Yu. "What do you mean by that? Do you have any way to deal with this scarlet sand beast? Or make it obey your orders?" At this time, The scarlet sand beast was speechless, and his eyes were helpless. At this time, he stared at Lin Yu fiercely. At this time, Lin Yu saw the scarlet sand beast like this. Although he had a smiling face, he silently sent a message to the scarlet sand beast in his heart. It's nothing, but I can use something to lure him, like this. At this time, Lin Yu took out a small bottle of pills from his arms, and then when Lin Yu opened the small white jade porcelain bottle, he threw it directly to Lian Huangsha, thinking in his heart when he ate some yellow sand at first. I am a dignified divine beast after all, how can I be teased by you? But the next second, when Lin Yu opened the small white jade porcelain bottle, the eyes of the red-striped yellow sand beast almost went straight, and the rich pill fragrance penetrated into the nostrils of the red-striped yellow sand beast, bit by bit. At this time, the red-striped yellow sand beast, without saying a word, rushed to Lin Yu's other hand so cooperatively, and then Lin Yu directly fed these pills into the mouth of the red-striped yellow sand beast. After swallowing such a large bottle of pills, the red sand beast showed a satisfied look on its face, and its belly began to swell slowly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 628. At this time, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang were shocked and dumbfounded when they saw this scene. Their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and their eyebrows were completely filled with emotion. A look of disbelief. At this time, the two of them were like this. They couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva, looking at Lin Yu with eyes full of disbelief. What? How is it possible? At this time, after Lin Yu saw Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang looking like this, a strange color flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. What's wrong? Is there any problem? But this little guy's appetite has really increased recently. Now he takes nearly 3 pills like this every day, which makes me almost unable to feed him. Lin Yu couldn't help but shook his head slightly at that time, and then sighed quietly, with a look of complete helplessness on his face. At this time, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang, who were standing by, saw 3 black lines on their foreheads when they saw Lin Yu like this, and they were speechless for a while. After waiting for a while, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang forced a smile from the corners of their mouths. Ha ha ha, where did you get these pills? At this time, Lin Yu just smiled. Do you still remember when Xinghong and I returned from the desert? Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly, his eyes staring straight at Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang. A bit of amusement flashed in his eyes, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became even brighter. Obvious. At this time, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang suddenly understood after hearing what Lin Yu said. I do remember this, so that's it, that's it? Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang looked at each other, then turned their heads and glanced at Lin Yu. You feed him these elixirs on weekdays? Then how can these elixirs be enough for you to consume? Su Yuyan's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu was thinking in his heart. Now that my system has been upgraded to the mall, there are as many of these pills as there are in them. After all, they only cost 10,000 points each. With my current several 100 million points, this is simply a drop in the bucket, and this is a drop in the bucket. It's not every day that the Scarlet Lian Huangsha beast can take the beast spirit pill and eat it casually. After hearing what Su Yuyan said, the Kilian Huangsha beast who was on the side couldn't help feeling helpless. At this moment, he also sighed softly. The eyes of this red-trained yellow sand beast were full of helplessness, and its heart was speechless for a while. At this moment, the Kilian Huangsha beast was thinking, this boy is reluctant to take out this beast spirit pill for me to eat on weekdays. He usually lets me absorb the spiritual power by myself. Today is not just for you. Show it off in front of me. However, although this red-trained yellow sand beast thought so in his heart, he did not dare to say it. This red-trained yellow sand beast just coughed lightly, and then smiled helplessly. Lin Yu just glanced in their direction, and then scratched his head deliberately, pretending not to understand anything. I don't know what this thing is, but I just feel that this little guy is very interested in this thing, so I feed him a little bit every day. At this moment, Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang were on the verge of crying for a while, and they were even more speechless at this moment. They just looked at each other, their eyes full of helplessness. Lin Yu saw the two of them acting like this and continued to hit them. What? Is there anything wrong with me feeding him like this? Lin Yu said softly, and then coughed softly. At this time, Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang just waved their hands casually after hearing what Lin Yu said. Ahem, how much more of this do you have? Lin Yu just took out nearly dozens of the same small white jade porcelain bottles. At this time, the red-trained yellow sand beast saw so many beast spirit pills that his eyes were a little straight. Of course, the red-trained yellow sand beast knew that all its brothers had reached the chaos level, or it is a god level, which means that the beast spirit pills that can be used by these epics and exotic beasts belong only to you. At this time, the red sand beast's eyebrows were full of excitement. At this time, he looked at Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang, as if he saw his benefactor. The two women, Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang, were instantly stunned after seeing so many beast spirit pills. And after the strange beasts in their two bodies saw so many beast spirit pills, the aura on their bodies began to gradually fluctuate. Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang looked at each other, and then calmed down their moods. At this time, the two of them finally came back to their senses. Sure enough, I didn't expect you to have so many beast spirit pills. However, feeding this kind of thing to your own beasts for a long time may have some side effects. I see that you also have so many beast spirit pills. Let me take my place first. Keep it safe. At this time, Suyuyan was speaking softly, but looking at the cunning look in her eyes, it was clear that this little girl had no good intentions. After Lin Yu heard what Suyuyan said, he just smiled. At this moment, he was thinking, I'll give it to you. It's no problem if I give it to you, but if this little guy doesn't give it to you, that's a big deal too, said it. At this time, Lin Yu heard Suyuyan. After saying this, he first pretended to be enlightened, and then patted his head. Oh, I see, you must not do this, and you must not have any side effects. If something really goes wrong with this little guy, then Elder Dugu and the others will definitely not let me go. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he quickly handed these small white jade porcelain bottles towards Suyuyan. At this time, Suyuyan was also pretending to be coy. Yes, so I reluctantly keep some of them for you to prevent you from using these beast spirit pills randomly. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 629. At this time, the Kilian Huangsha beast who was standing by saw the scene and was eager to kill. At this time, the Kilian yellow sand beast began to secretly send a message into Lin Yu's mind, Master, can you leave some for me, even just one bottle? At this time, Lin Yu faced the red sand beast with a smile on his face and said, I said I would give it to them, but it doesn't matter whether you agree or not. Anyway, these are your rations. How much you can keep is entirely up to you. Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly like this, the smile at the corner of his mouth was even more obvious, and there was quite a bit of playfulness in his eyes. After waiting for a while, the scarlet-trained yellow sand beast suddenly became excited. At this time, the scarlet-trained yellow sand beast suddenly rose to nearly the height of a person. At this time, the scarlet-trained yellow sand beast directly he stood in front of Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang. After Suyuyan, Ye Lengshuang saw this scene, their brows seemed to be twisted together, and their eyes were fixed directly on the body of the red sand beast. Then he spoke in such a low voice. Actually, we just want to keep it for you. Don't be angry, don't be angry. Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang whispered like this. But it was obvious that Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang didn't believe what the redly and yellow sand beast said. The redly and yellow sand beast let out an angry roar, followed by a few drops of blood on its body. The energy just started to solidify. Then, right after, Battle Gangfeng took shape so quietly in front of the red-trained yellow sand beast. At this time, Ye Lengshuang, who was standing aside, saw Suyuyan's smile, and her smallest smile became more and more obvious, and her eyes were quite playful, and she seemed to be very knowledgeable. A kind of gloating look. After Suyuyan saw Ye Lengshuang like this, she turned away at that time. Later, her eyes stared at Ye Lengshuang, and then she winked secretly. At this time, Ye Lengshuang seemed to be pretending not to see it on purpose, and ignored Suyuyan at all. 3 black lines appeared on Suyuyan's forehead, and she was speechless for a while. At this time, Suyuyan looked completely deflated. Lin Yu, who was on the side, was naturally ecstatic after seeing this scene. Lin Yu just stared at the two of them with a smile on his face, and there was quite a bit of amusement in his eyes. But that hint of amusement was quickly covered up by Lin Yu. Lin Yu deliberately pretended to be surprised, and then pretended to scold the red sand beast. How could you do this? Hurry up and give these things to others. Didn't you hear what they said just now? They said that eating these things is not good for you. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the red sand beast immediately understood what it meant to be both responsible and independent. However, the aura of the red-trained yellow sand beast at this time was even more decisive. The red-trained yellow sand beast suddenly took a step forward, and then followed by the few killing blows on its body. The anger started like this, and suddenly it seemed to be frozen. The coercion exuded by this red-trained yellow sand beast is naturally not comparable to that of ordinary strange beasts. After a while, when everyone saw this scene, they couldn't help but look at each other. They just coughed lightly, and then smiled. Forget it, if you don't want to give this thing to us, then we don't want it, so that's okay. In the end, Suyuyan felt helpless, so she could only retreat for the time being. At this time, the red refined yellow sand beast heard Suyuyan say this, and nodded with satisfaction, and then immediately put away some of his aura. At this time, after Suyuyan saw the red-trained yellow sand beast like this, her teeth were itching with anger, and she felt helpless in her heart. At this time, Lin Yu just scratched his head, and then took these things back. Okay, I'm sorry, it's all because of this guy's disobedience, and your good intentions have been wasted. After I can completely control this guy, I must make him apologize to you. Lin Yu whispered like this, staring directly at Suyuyan, and then scratched his head and smiled. At this time, Suyuyan waved her hands gently, and then coughed lightly. Ahem, it's nothing, it's nothing. A few complex colors flashed through Suyuyan's eyes, her face was slightly raised, and she felt helpless in her heart. At this time, Ye Lengshuang, who was standing by, suddenly discovered that in fact, the hands that ate some yellow sand seemed to listen to Lin Yu quite well. For example, when Lin Yu put these things away, the Qi Lian Huang, the sand beast, didn't react at all. And when these beast spirit pills were in Lin Yu's hands, the red-trained yellow sand beast had no intention of snatching them away. Instead, it looked at Lin Yu respectfully. After Suyuyan saw this scene, the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. Her eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and her eyes were even more intense. It's a bit playful. After waiting for a while, Suyuyan seemed to notice that something was wrong. She turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu. Her eyes were looking directly at Lin Yu. Lin Yu's scalp was even a little numb. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but scratch his head and smile. Then he turned his head and glanced at Suyuyan, and then said softly, "What's wrong? Is there something on my face?" At this time, Suyuyan was staring at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, a bit of amusement flashed in her eyes, and then she slowly walked towards Lin Yu. There's really nothing on your face, but there's just something I'm curious about. After Lin Yu heard what Suyin said, he was as confused as a 2-foot-tall monk. There was a look of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he frowned slightly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 630. What? What are you curious about? You might as well tell me about it. Lin Yu stared at Suyin with a smile on his face, and the playfulness at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, Suyin slowly walked towards Lin Yu, and then whispered in Lin Yu's ear. Actually, it's nothing. I just found out why the guy reacted so violently when you gave this thing to us, and when you took it back yourself, the guy didn't react at all. This is the first point. The second point is even more strange, that is, when you told him to stop just now, he still seemed to listen to you. Suyin just stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and there was a bit of amusement in her eyes. At this time, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He just scratched his head and smiled, and then waved his hand casually. Are you kidding? This may just be like this by chance. Normally this guy doesn't listen to me at all. He has no conscience. Lin Yu could only helplessly identify in a low voice, and at this time, Suyin obviously did not believe the nonsense Lin Yu said. At this time, Suyin's eyes were staring at Lin Yu, her face was slightly raised, and her brows seemed to be knitted together. Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think I will believe what you say? After Suyin finished speaking, she took a step forward, and then came to Lin Yu, her eyes fixed on Lin Yu. When Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but cough lightly, and then he scratched his head in embarrassment and smiled. Ahem, this. Suyin quietly took a few steps back, then glanced at Lin Yu, and then spoke in a deep voice. Actually, now you can completely control the red sand beast, right? But why do you deliberately play tricks on the two of us? I'm very curious about this, and I hope you can give me an explanation. Suyin said coldly, her eyes fixed on Lin Yu, and her expression suddenly condensed. Lin Yu just spread his hands gently and smiled. Actually, I can only control it a little bit. If I say I can control it completely, it is naturally impossible. After all, this big guy is not easy to control. But if you can control it a little bit, there will be no problem. Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly, staring directly at Suyin, not looking like he was lying. At this time, Suyin gently rubbed her chin, and then half closed her eyes. Are you telling the truth? After what happened just now, we don't believe you at all. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Suyin said, he couldn't help but cough lightly, and then nodded heavily. Conscience of heaven and earth, everything I say is true, there is absolutely no lie. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Suyin, and then he spoke in a low voice. After Suyin heard Lin Yu say this, her eyes stared straight at Lin Yu. But Suyin didn't notice anything strange in Lin Yu's eyes. At this time, Suyin nodded with satisfaction, then waved her hands gently and smiled. Very good, I believe what you said this time, but teasing the teacher is not what a good student should do. What do you think I should do to punish you now? Suyin walked slowly towards Lin Yu, the smile at the corner of her mouth gradually became more obvious, and there was a bit of amusement in her eyes. After seeing this scene, Ye Lengshuang knew that this poor little guy was probably going to be in trouble again. However, Ye Lengshuang was also a little angry about what had just happened, so she had no intention of helping Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu could not help but have 3 black lines appear on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He never thought that Suyin, a little girl, would have such obvious insight. After Lin Yu thought of this, he couldn't help but cough lightly, and then others smiled like this. Ahem, this. But who would have expected that Suyuyan would just pull away and step back, then cross her legs, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became even more obvious. Forget it, I don't want to talk any more nonsense to you. How about I give you a chance now? Suyuyan spoke unhurriedly, and then stared straight at Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu heard Suyuyan. After saying this, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead. The speechlessness in his heart became more and more obvious. After all, Lin Yu had said such words before. You said it to someone else, but now that his identity was suddenly switched and he was called Lin Yu, it was really hard to get used to it. He, what kind of chance can you give me? I want to hear it. I want to go to the misty forest tomorrow. When that time comes, you can go with me. I can help you try to control the red sand beast and cultivate the tacit understanding between you two. At this time, Ye Lengshuang heard Suyuyan, and after saying this, his brows couldn't help but frown slightly, and then he turned his head and looked at Suyuyan, and then whispered. Are you playing too much like this? You must know what the misty forest represents, and the identity of this little guy is extraordinary. In that case, I'm afraid. Ye Lengshuang whispered in Suyuyan's ear. At this time, Suyuyan just smiled after hearing what Ye Lengshuang said, and then turned her head and looked at Ye Lengshuang, with a bit of playfulness in her eyes. Believe me, this little guy has hidden more than what you see. He must have hidden something else.